Welcome back. You're listening to the discussion Modern Authentication Strategies to Embrace Zero Trust, sponsored by Duo Security on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today is Brian Rosenstiel, a cybersecurity architect for the public sector at Cisco's Duo Security. Brian, we talked a lot about managed security services, the user experience. Let's jump into the Zero Trust discussion. Where does Zero Trust fit into this entire conversation? Because again, if you don't have good user experience, Zero Trust doesn't work very well or can not work as well as it could.
Yeah, so this is where it gets interesting, right? Because previous discussion we talked about how important it is to embrace users, embrace the culture. Best thing is when everyone's running around and saying, "Hey, look, this is so great." Um, and the idea here is that it's always transparent to the user what's actually going on behind the scenes. Now, on the flip side of this, we can't trust a single one of them. In fact, you shouldn't. That's the idea of zero trust. Is that we should never have base level assumptions that everything is going as it should. Instead, what we need to do, we're still going to trust. We'll hit the verify, and then we're going to verify again, and verify a couple more times, and make sure that we're still verifying after we verify. Right? That's the kind of idea and the mentality that we have to go into it. And so when we think about that again, put the lens back on to authentication, which is near and dear to my heart, and we say, okay, that user, we have to validate not only that they are who they say they are through the use of strong authenticators, but we also have to make sure that the way in which they're authenticating is something that is trustworthy. That was a lot easier a few years ago when everyone was confined in the same brick buildings. That's a lot harder today. We knew we were going this direction. We knew this was important, and then all of a sudden, someone hit the gas, and we went into it, at 200 miles an hour, and everyone said, okay, how do we actually now make sure that we still have a handle on what is interacting in our environment and what does identity mean anyway? I think that was the biggest lesson of last year, is actually relearning what identity always was, but what it actually meant with the modern world and modern networks and the way that people are connecting.
And it goes back to something I'll hit upon that I think you said earlier, is about kind of understanding where the user fits in. And when everyone started to do remote working, all of a sudden they logged on from home with their own Wi-Fi network and maybe even their own computer or a laptop that the agency gave them. But because they weren't inside the bubble of the network or of the protections, then the user became the center, if you will, of that cybersecurity. Is that why you think Zero Trust is getting so much more discussion and agencies are starting to, we heard from OMB and CISA just recently at the Senate hearing that I mentioned, how it's a new Zero Trust paradigm, whatever that's going to mean eventually.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing it across, not just from them. NSA released guidance around Zero Trust. I mean, Zero Trust is bubbling up everywhere. And I think what it was is because people realized, okay, so we always thought about end users and we always thought about identity. And when you say end user identity, you always think of the person behind the keyboard, right? Hey, my driver's license has my picture on it. I am who I say I am. Okay, I'm trustworthy. Let's proceed. But Zero Trust looks at it from an end entity. And an entity is different than just the person. An entity is kind of a more holistic view of identity. It's all the different components that go into the authentication. In fact, who I am from a digital identity perspective literally changes based upon time of day, based upon even on the same workstation. On the same workstation, I can present very different security challenges, right? If I'm trying to log in with Internet Explorer and I've got Flash enabled, that's a very different security concern than if I'm coming in with a different browser that is automatically blocking those things. We need to be checking for those. That is a part of who I am because it is a part of how I'm engaging and interacting with network resources and data and all of those different components and pieces. That's what identity actually is. It always has been. We just took a lot of things for granted because we had a lot more control. That control was always shifting with globalization, with more and more different interconnected systems, with less reliance upon physical perimeter security. But now with the rise of telework, which in many ways is just here to stay permanently, it is forever shifted. And even the concept of issuing people a laptop and a phone is in question. right? I mean, the idea of a fully managed devices for all of your endpoints, we can no longer take that for granted. In fact, you never really should. Maybe you still have managed devices, but you need to make sure that you have checks involved to make sure that only managed devices are actually authenticating it. And again, go back to the example of the worker that I was talking with, spoke about earlier, who said, "Yeah, I'm using my personal Gmail account." There are ways of interacting with systems that you may not have thought about. So, what you need to do is, where it makes sense, authentication is one of them, be checking for every possible type of connection, or at least in the way that makes sense. And only through doing that, through these kind of central channels, are you going to have, I think, the best chance for success in such a complex and diverse world that we find ourselves in.
A lot of agencies are heading down the path of zero trust. The continuous diagnostics mitigation program, as one example, is providing a lot of those tools, those pieces that create that zero trust architecture. What's the current state for many agencies? How are they creating that zero trust environment, and then how can they move forward?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is understanding, and I've said it before, but people realizing the strength of your authenticator doesn't equate to the strength of your authentication. We have incredibly strong authenticators, right? I'll pick on the PIV and the CAT because they're near and dear to my heart. And I always tell people, the core crypto behind it, if you try to brute force it, a lot of the stars that are currently shining in the sky will burn out before you're able to do it. I mean, talk about a strong authenticator. But what does it actually tell you when you authenticate? Well, it tells you that you have the authenticator. It's proof of possession. That's as far as it goes. And that's all of our authenticators, really. I can't really think of one authenticator by itself that is going to be able to tell us so much more that we need to know whether or not to validate that authentication. Instead, dynamic policy authentication engines are what are able to do that. So what we have to do is we have to enhance our current authenticators. Now, the other thing that this does too is, because we're going to start putting in kind of these policy enforcement and policy discovery, device discovery pieces in line within the workflow of our authentication, some really interesting things come as a result. So I always liken authentication to going over a bridge. On the other side of the bridge is your, whatever it may be. Maybe it's a data lake, maybe it's an application, whatever task that user needs to get to. Now, to get to the bridge, they could have come from any different direction, right? And they can arrive at any different type of state to be able to do it. They still have to walk across that bridge. They still have to cross that bridge. So we can do as much discovery during that authentication workflow as possible. Then we can get quality data as to what's actually coming in. So this goes back to kind of your mention of CDM. CDM, one of the phases is who is on the network. That question of who is a lot more expensive than what we previously thought, as we've discussed. Now, I could go out and pull, let's say, 400,000 devices and get a device security posture across 400,000 devices, and then try to say, well, that's my perimeter. Or I could actually do my data discovery with every single user and entity, holistic view of identity, that is authenticating into that resource. And over a period of time, I will actually know how many of those 400,000 are actually authenticating in, and what the security profile is like when they're doing the authentication. So now, rather than trying to understand a field of haystacks and the data that lies within, we've really targeted down and narrowed down and have quality data that we can start analyzing. And I think that's what people are striving towards. I think they're looking at what doesn't change in distributed kind of perimeters that we find ourselves in. Where are the commonalities? And that's where we need to focus our policy engines and our discovery.
In many ways, it's protecting what's most valuable. It's understanding the data behind it. So we need this to make this mission work well. And if we don't have this data, or if this data gets compromised in some way, that really impacts the mission. And then it's also, we've talked a lot about the high value assets piece, and it's a term OMB uses quite often. But what is it? What systems, what networks, what data are central to your agency that you can't live without? So I think agencies have done a pretty good job of discovering that. Is the next step the roles and responsibilities around it? Brian can see this data, but Brian can't change the data, or Brian can see the data and touch the data, or maybe Brian can't see anything. Is that the next step where agencies are heading?
Yeah, exactly. It's a journey. The journey is going to be different for every organization, every agency, every federal department that's out there, right? We're all at some sort of semblance. You know, it kind of starts with, hey, let's get multi-factor authentication across all accounts. I say all accounts, it includes things like privileged admin accounts. That sounds silly, but we know there are still things like shared admin accounts that are out there, right? Shared admin accounts don't really work well with smart cards, and yet they still exist. Well, let's put multi-factor on those. It actually can be done, and you can do it in a way where you still have identity assurance and identity binding per an individual. Maybe you don't have it in the primary authenticator of username and password because you know it, I know it, a dozen other people know it, but we can absolutely make sure that each one of us only has one authenticator assigned so that we still have a login to know, hey, Administrator Brian logged into this system at this particular time using this shared account. So it's kind of, I call it kind of going back to basics, understanding where are you as an organization in this zero trust journey. And then once you kind of have a base level set, and to your point, you start figuring out, okay, the next step on this journey is going to be around, hey, maybe Brian shouldn't be able to log into everything. Maybe we need to restrict some of those. Real world example of that is, hey, Brian has a domain admin account. The only thing he should be able to log into is a domain controller. How are we mitigating that today? We can't rely on Active Directory because Brian has the ability of modifying Active Directory. So maybe we need to be doing this through a separate control and do things that way, right? So you start realizing what where you're at, what is where you want to go, and what capabilities are currently in play for you to be able to get there. And then where you find those gaps, that allows you to kind of target and enhance your environment. So what we're not talking about is a rip and replace strategy for zero trust. It's quite the opposite. It's enhance what you have. Everyone is already on the journey towards zero trust. You know, one of the things that always kind of a pet peeve is when people say, well, no one in the federal government's implemented zero trust. Well, it's not a thing that you can go out and buy and put in. It's a strategy. Everyone in the federal government has already implemented at least some semblance of zero trust. They're all on the journey. We've been on that journey since the very first passwords got implemented way back when, you know, decades and decades ago. Now what it's about is making sure that we enhance existing environments in a meaningful way, and in a way that doesn't result in lots of decentralization of administrative controls that end up becoming a nightmare to manage. Instead, let's centralize a lot of these policies together and do more with what we have from a manpower, an administrative power standpoint, and take advantage of that moving forward.
Brian, there's so much more to talk to. Unfortunately, we are out of time for today. So let me thank my guest. Brian Rosensteel is a cybersecurity architect for the public sector at Cisco's Duo Security. Brian, thank you so much for the time.
Oh, thank you. Always a pleasure.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion Modern Authentication Strategies to Embrace Zero Trust, sponsored by Duo Security on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Duo Security.